What crime deserves death by slow strangulation, your feet kicking just above the mud, with a crowd watching you twist? For most pirates, that was the end they feared. But for women, the gallows were the kindest option. Across 3 centuries, at least 100 women were accused of piracy on the open seas. Some fought with swords, some commanded ships, some simply joined crews, but nearly all shared the same fate once captured. Not a fair trial, not a quick execution, but punishment designed to break them completely. Public beatings, forced concubinage, rotting prison ships, torture, erasure from history. And when they died, if they died, their names were often removed from the records or twisted beyond recognition. This is Dark History Uncovered. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe silence is a tool of power, subscribe. Let us keep these voices from vanishing again. Comment where you are watching from. We read every comment, and your support helps us keep telling the stories others skip. Today, only a handful of those names survive, like Bonny, the bold Irish-born pirate who fought in the Caribbean, and Mary Red, her close companion, possibly her lover, who dressed as a man and fought alongside her. These 2 women are remembered because their trials were documented in colonial Jamaica in 1720, but most female pirates were not granted even that kind of legacy. Instead, they disappeared into silence. Their stories were not forgotten by accident. They were erased deliberately, and that is where we begin. In the early 1700s, piracy was one of the British Empire's greatest concerns. The Caribbean was full of smugglers, mutineers, and rogue captains attacking merchant ships. To respond, the British set up admiralty courts, special tribunals where piracy could be tried without a jury. These courts existed outside normal colonial justice systems and operated under maritime law. The results were harsh for men, but for women, even worse. Female pirates were seen not only as criminals but as unnatural. That word, unnatural, appeared often in the records. It meant they had stepped outside the roles assigned to them by law, by religion, and by gender. These women were not just judged for violence or theft, they were judged for being women who had taken up space that society believed belonged to men. Take the trial of Bonny and Mary Red, 2 of the most famous female pirates in history. They were captured in 1720 by Captain Jonathan Barnett off the coast of Jamaica. When brought to trial in Spanish Town, the prosecution spent as much time talking about their clothing as their crimes. Both women wore trousers, men's jackets, and bandanas. That was not a legal violation, but it was treated as proof of their moral corruption. No jury heard their case. No defense attorney made arguments on their behalf. The court heard testimonies mostly from British naval officers, men who would personally benefit from a conviction. At the time, successful piracy prosecutions brought not only prestige, but also prize money, as captured ships and cargo were legally distributed among those involved in the arrest. The only legal option Bonny and Red had was a desperate one: pleading the belly. This was an old clause in English law, allowing pregnant women to delay execution until after childbirth. It was not a pardon, it was a postponement, but it was one of the few protections the legal system afforded to women. Both Bonny and Red used this defense. Court-appointed physicians confirmed their conditions, and for a short time, they were spared the noose. But that delay was not always salvation. Mary Red died soon after, not from execution but from illness while still in custody. Records list her cause of death as fever. No burial was recorded. Bonny's fate remains unclear. Some believe her father bribed officials to secure her release. Others believe she escaped. The official record ends with a single word: remanded. Unlike some male pirates, who occasionally spared the rope by agreeing to serve in the British Navy, they swapped one ship for another, the Jolly Roger for the Royal Navy's flag. But women were never offered such deals. There was no second chance. There was no enlistment, no service, no commutation, just judgment. Their verdicts were decided long before they ever opened their mouths. Before facing the gallows, many women felt the whip. One of the most common punishments for captured pirates, especially in colonies like Jamaica, Virginia, or Port Royal, was flogging. It was brutal, it was public, and it was designed to shame. The tool used was called the cat o' nine tails, a whip made from 9 heavy cords, each knotted at the end. Every strike tore skin and muscle. A skilled executioner could flay a person's back in a matter of minutes, without killing them, at least not immediately. For male pirates, flogging was already torture. But for women, it became a spectacle. Women were stripped to the waist and tied to whipping posts in public squares or on harbor docks. These punishments were often scheduled during market days, not by accident but by design. The goal was to maximize the number of witnesses, merchants, sailors, children, tourists, all encouraged to watch. Officials would read the charges aloud beforehand. Not just crimes like robbery or mutiny, but charges like behavior unbecoming to a woman or abandonment of feminine conduct. The message was clear. She had stepped out of line. In 1721, a woman named Mary Harley stood trial in Port Royal. She was a crew member on a pirate vessel operating in the Caribbean. The court sentenced her to 39 lashes, not only for piracy, but for conduct unbecoming to her station as a woman. She survived the punishment, but records say she carried permanent scars across her shoulders and back. Those scars were not just physical. Flogging caused torn muscles, severed nerves, and chronic pain that could last a lifetime. Some women lost full use of their arms. Others developed infections that eventually killed them. And the psychological cost was just as real. Imagine being paraded half-naked before your town, mocked by strangers, your name shouted as a warning. Female pirates were reduced from dangerous enemies to objects of pity, humiliation, and fear. Officials did not do this to correct behavior. They did it to make an example. They did it so every woman in the crowd would remember what happened when you left the life assigned to you. For some female pirates, death did not come at the gallows. It came in silence, on ships that were never meant to move again. By the mid-1700s, the British Empire faced a problem. Their land-based prisons were overcrowded. As piracy surged, especially in the Caribbean and American colonies, there was no room to hold the growing number of captured sailors, rebels, and criminals. So they turned to old warships. These decommissioned vessels, stripped of sails and anchored permanently in harbors, became known as prison hulks. Their names varied: the HMS York, the HMS Justicia, the Worcester, but their purpose was the same. They were floating tombs. Below deck, prisoners were packed in like cargo. Each person was given an average of 18 inches of space, barely enough to lie flat. Ventilation was almost non-existent. Light did not reach the lower levels. Waste collected in corners. Disease spread fast. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox. According to the logs of the HMS York, more than 60% of prisoners died within 6 months of confinement, and that was just the average. Many died far sooner. But for women, the danger was not just disease. Female pirates confined on these hulks were uniquely vulnerable. Guards and sailors often controlled access to food, clean water, or medical treatment. In exchange, they demanded compliance. Refuse and you might face beatings, reduced rations, or solitary confinement in dark compartments with no air and no relief. A woman named Maria Lindsay, captured during a 1730 raid on Spanish treasure ships, was taken to one such hulk anchored near Kingston, Jamaica. Spanish records state she endured multiple rounds of interrogation under customary pressure. That phrase, customary pressure, was used to describe methods including physical restraint, denial of food, and even torture. Maria died before her second month aboard the ship. There was no grave, no marker. In fact, most female deaths on prison ships were not recorded at all. Officials preferred it that way. These women were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to vanish into rot, into shadows, into statistics. Unlike public hangings, there were no witnesses, no final words, no headlines, only silence. Not every captured female pirate was sentenced to death. Some were sentenced to something worse. In colonial ports like Cartagena, Portobello, and Havana, authorities often bypassed execution altogether, especially in Spanish and Portuguese territories, and instead sold women directly into slavery or forced concubinage. The logic was simple. These women were considered spoils of war. They were not viewed as political prisoners. They were not entitled to a trial. If they were captured on a pirate vessel, they were treated as merchandise. A 1687 record from the Portobello archives lists 3 unnamed English women taken from a ship called the Revenge. Each was sold for 40 pieces of 8, a common silver coin used throughout the Spanish Americas. Their ages, conditions, and destinations were not recorded. Their names were never written down again. Spanish colonial officials had little interest in determining whether a woman was a pirate, a sailor's partner, or a captive taken by force, especially if the woman was black, indigenous, or of mixed race. In such cases, the assumption was automatic. They were slaves. There were no questions, no paperwork. They were sold to the highest bidder. Sometimes these women were sent to plantations, where they labored under brutal conditions with little chance of survival. Other times they were kept as domestic servants in the homes of merchants or governors. In both roles, many were subjected to sexual exploitation by their owners or the men around them. A few were retained temporarily for interrogation, especially if they were believed to have knowledge of smuggling routes or buried treasure. But once questioned, they were sold like the rest. Some of the buyers specifically requested women with seafaring experience, believing they might be useful for local trade routes. But whatever value they held, it was always assigned by someone else. Ownership also meant erasure. New names were given. Traditional languages were forbidden. Clothing was replaced with coarse slave garments. Religious baptisms were often recorded in local church records, but even those entries list them only as English woman or foreign servant, with no trace of their former lives. Freedom turned into captivity. Identity turned into commodity. And history, if it remembered them at all, remembered only the price they fetched. Some female pirates were not whipped, not hanged, not sold. They were simply left behind. Marooning was an old punishment used by pirate crews and colonial authorities alike. It meant abandonment, leaving someone alone on an uninhabited island or isolated shoreline with no means of escape. It was seen as a middle ground between mercy and execution. But for women, it was often a sentence of drawn-out psychological collapse. The chosen locations were carefully selected: small coral islands with no fresh water, thick brush, and no signs of civilization. They were often visible from passing ships, but not reachable without help, a constant reminder of hope just out of reach. Victims were usually left with a small bag of hardtack biscuits, a dense, long-lasting naval food made from flour and water. Sometimes they were given a bottle of rum and a single-shot pistol. The pistol was not meant for defense. It was meant as a choice between suffering slowly or dying quickly. One of the few documented cases involved a woman named Charlotte Delegedly, marooned in 1724 on a barren islet near Tortuga, off the coast of present-day Haiti. Spanish fishermen discovered her 3 months later, sunburned, starved, and no longer lucid. She believed she was still aboard ship. She spoke to people who were not there. She died days after rescue. Her mind had not survived what her body barely had. The psychological impact of marooning was extreme. Hunger, dehydration, isolation, all combined to break down the mind. Many women began talking to themselves. Some built imaginary shelters. Others waded into the sea, chasing mirages. There are no full records of how many women were marooned, but the stories that survive point to a simple pattern. These women were not meant to be executed publicly. They were meant to vanish, slowly, painfully, and completely alone. Not every female pirate died in chains, on the whip post, or forgotten in a shallow grave. A few survived, but they did so by surrendering something else. One of the most extraordinary examples was Ching Shih, a former sex worker who became the most powerful pirate in history. In the early 1800s, she commanded over 300 ships and 40,000 pirates off the coast of southern China. When imperial forces finally moved against her, she did not fight. She negotiated. In 1810, she brokered a deal with the Chinese government, full amnesty for herself and over 17,000 of her crew in exchange for military service. She retained her fortune, kept her fleet, and even married her adopted son, who served as her second in command. It was not a romantic story, it was a political one. Ching Shih ended her life as a bureaucrat, technically an admiral under imperial rule. Her transformation came at a cost, her independence, but she avoided execution. Another survivor was Grace O'Malley, an Irish pirate queen of the late 1500s. When arrested by English forces in 1593, she demanded, and received, a personal audience with Queen Elizabeth I. She pled her case, emphasized her loyalty to Ireland, and negotiated her release. She lived out her final years under English surveillance, her power greatly reduced, but she died free. Even Anne Bonny, whose fate after prison remains unclear, may have survived through behind-the-scenes intervention. Some historians believe her father, a plantation owner in the Carolinas, bribed Jamaican officials. Others suggest she fled to the American colonies and lived under a different name. All of these women made choices. They abandoned piracy. They submitted to law. They accepted the systems that had once sought to destroy them. They lived, but they did not live as pirates.